within the tradition of Islamic understanding of the Quran. But if there has been something really new over the last 1400 years that can be pinpointed, that is the scientific tafsir. So we do have a new thing that has emerged over the course of last century, starting with the late 19th century, 1880 to be exact, and right up to our own time. And today, in my short talk, I want to understand this process. I want to say something about why this happened, what is it that they are trying to do, and whether or not it can be considered a legitimate addition to our types of tafsir. Of course, we have types of tafsir, as mentioned yesterday by Professor Nasr, but they have all emerged within the discourse on the Quran, and nobody ever rejected those on the basis of bid'ah. But the scientific tafsir, the topic of my talk today, to me it seems that it does have problems, and I'll mention some of them. But first of all, let us revisit the origin of the world of nature versus the Quran itself. As we all know, every single argument that the Quran presents to humanity can ultimately be put into one of the three domains from which it derives all its content, all its material: the natural world, human history, and the nafs. سَنُرِهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. The three realms, the three domains from which all of the Quranic data comes, of course, contains the natural world. And by now, people have counted that there are 750 so-called scientific verses of the Quran. So the natural world is a constant present backdrop. The natural world is one of the manifestations of God's revelation. The natural world is called an ayah, just as the verses of the Quran are called ayats. There is a seamless semantic linkage between the descriptions of the natural world in the Quran and the verses of the Quran, the speech of God himself. So there is no doubt that the natural world is present in the Quran. The moving of the sun and the moon, the coming and going of the day and the night, the water cycle, the clouds, the day and the night, the rain, and 31 surahs of the Quran are actually named after the natural objects or phenomena. So all of those are there. But the interesting thing is that until the 19th century, no one actually thought of coming up with a different, specifically different kind of tafsir called the scientific tafsir. So this is very intriguing. And one could have dismissed the emergence of the so-called scientific tafsir just on that basis that it is a bid'ah. It hasn't happened for 1300 years and suddenly it has happened. But now we are living in a time when anything new is actually more appealing. Like we routinely throw out these gadgets we use every 6 months because the new ones have come up, because there is a fascination for the new, as if the old is somehow inferior by definition. And that mindset also informs this idea that there has to be something continuously new coming out of even the most fundamental human concerns and human conditions. Therefore, we cannot use just this logical aspect to say that, well, this is a bid'ah, this can be discarded. But the question that arises, another question that arises, is that we all know that the Islamic scientific tradition, which is still the longest known scientific enterprise in human history in terms of duration of time. If you look at the Greek science, the Roman science, or the modern science, they haven't yet, well, the previous ones are dead, but the modern science hasn't really attained the number of years of living experience, of actually being operative compared to the Islamic scientific tradition, no matter which scale we use, because beginning with the 8th century onwards, up until the 15th century by some accounts, and 16th century by other accounts. So we do have 700 years of solid, high-class science coming out of Islamic civilization, but none of those scientists, and some of them were qualified Quran scholars, ever thought of writing a scientific tafsir. They all knew that there are so many verses, the sign verses in the Quran. They all knew, they all had the knowledge, and they had the qualifications. But no one said, well, I found this discovery yesterday through my experiments, and look, it's in the Quran as well. We don't find that kind of approach. What was the reason? And why did it have to happen in the 19th century when the Islamic scientific tradition was dead? And the Muslim encounter with modern science took place at that time. It was said, I think you said it yesterday, and it's very true, that each mufassir is conditioned by the time, the place, the events, the history in which he, or in some cases she, operates. This is true. And I think this is one of the ways we can think about the emergence of modern science and Muslim encounter with modern science at a time, and this must be noted, at a time when, number one, the Islamic scientific tradition was dead. Number two, and this is very important to note, that the entire Muslim world, almost the entire Muslim world, had been colonized. So the emergence of scientific tafsir took place under social, political, economic, and intellectual conditions in which the colonization of the Muslim world, physically as well as intellectually, the colonization of the mind as well, was the most dominant phenomena. And all these people who started this new bid'ah, they did it for certain agendas. First, all of them were reformers of one kind or another kind. And their agenda was to wake up what they consider Muslim world, the sleeping Muslim mind. Get up, look what's happening. You have been colonized, and in their assessment, the Muslim world was colonized because, and this is true to some extent, because they didn't have science and technology. So the agenda was to invite Muslims to gain Western scientific knowledge. But they wanted to use the Quran for their agenda, and therefore they had to legitimate their agenda in the Quranic discourse. Second, of course, we all know the 19th century was the most devastating century as far as the Islamic intellectual thought is concerned. It was a century, we are still living the fruits of that very century, in which very little took place in the Muslim world by way of intellectual achievement, not to talk about the scientific, economic, and other achievements. But it was also a century when Muslims, for the first time, encountered huge number of missionary activities all over the traditional lands of Islam. And of course, there were debates about the veracity of the Quran, about the Muslim claim that this is indeed the speech of God. And one of the ways these reformers thought of proving, and this trend is still going on, proving that the Quran is the word of God, was to say, look, this discovery was made yesterday in Europe. How could Prophet Muhammad have known it at his time? Therefore, the Quran is the word of God. And this happens now in huge gatherings at ISNA conventions and all over the rest, and you hear lots of Allahu Akbars. When Muslims hear this, that the Big Bang found yesterday was already mentioned in the Quran, when they see these images of the development of the child inside mother's womb superimposed on the ayahs of the Quran, they say, Allahu Akbar. This is the word of the Quran, because now science has verified it. So we have a twist here. We have a twist here in the epistemology being used. Instead of the Quran being ipso facto believed to be the word of God, we need an external agent, namely the modern Western science to prove that the Quran is the word of God. And the ironic situation is that none of the scientific discoveries made so far by modern science needs the Quran. You can explain every single thing without even invoking God. And when you talk to these Muslim brothers or sisters, they say, you know, I believe in the Quran to be the word of God, but it is for the non-believers, it's for the disbelievers that I'm doing this. This is a dawah technique that we are using because everyone believes in the science, so it's not for me. But when you ask them the next question, that science can explain better than the Quran can do the same phenomena, then why would a non-believer believe it? They have no answer. Plus, the additional problem is there are so many aspects of the Quran which the science cannot prove. And that's where certain fundamental problems arise in this scientific tafsir. For example, this is almost like a joke, but we had a seminar in Edmonton, and one of the things which were said in that seminar was the throwing of Ibrahim alayhi salam in the fire, and the fire didn't burn him. And after the seminar, a young Muslim student got up and he said, you know, I have studied fire very thoroughly. And in fact, I have discovered, and this is proven by modern science, that there is one zone of fire that is very cool. There are 7 zones, and one of those zones of fires in the flame is very cold. And Ibrahim alayhi salam was sitting in that very zone. You see, the reductionism that happens in the mind of the Muslims is that everything has to fit within the scientific discourse. If something is beyond it, and we have the problem, of course, of the creation of the first human being, Adam alayhi salam. And there are people who take that as metaphorical. Like we have tafasirs or notes on the Quranic translations, as Professor Nasr mentioned yesterday. Asad is one example. There are several other examples like that. When it comes to the point of cleavage, when there is no possible explanation scientifically available, then it becomes ridiculous. They have to break every single mold to somehow fit that extra scientific or supra-scientific detail from the Quran into their own view of what the text should be saying. Now, if we look at the classical tradition, of course, as I said, everybody knew that the Quran contains details about the natural world. What did they do? Of course, it was known to them that these details are out there, because the interesting aspect of the Quranic discourse as proofs it offers is that it does not require specialization in modern physics or quantum mechanics to understand what is being said. So, for example, when it says, look at the coming and going of the night, had Allah wished, He would have made the night perpetual for you, and who would bring the light to you so that you find your rizq? Or who would bring the night to you so that you can rest? Everybody knows that the night and the day alternate. Likewise, this latest fad that we have about the embryology, we take Dr. Keith Moore to Saudi Arabia, give him this ayah about the nutfa and mudgha, ask him to do the CAT scans and the ultrasonic images, and we superimpose those images from the mother's womb. And then we say, you see, this is nutfa, this is mudgha, this is how the child is being born. And the Quran says this, it has said this 1400 years ago. The Prophet didn't have these sonographs, therefore it is the word of God. But the point is, those who heard that discourse during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they did not need the ultrasonic scans to know what is being said. So all details that we add, yes, they can increase the awe and the wonder, of course. There is a beauty, there is a certain sense of detail that one attains by studying this. But it does not add or subtract from the message of the Quran. Those who wanted to believe, at that time they did, that this is the word of God, and those who did not want to believe did not, same as now. But there is something very interesting that I want to point out about how they used, how the classical tradition used these so-called sign ayahs. What was the understanding, for example, at the time of Imam Ghazali, who points out in his book, Jawahirul Qur'an, something very interesting about the detail required to understand the exact nature. And I need to quote this from that book. He says that we have already mentioned that the Quran is like an ocean without a shore. And indeed, if all oceans were to become ink, for the words of my Lord, surely the oceans would be exhausted before the words of my Lord came to an end. Among the actions of Allah, may He be exalted, which are like a sea of actions, are recovery and disease. And He, the Most High, mentioned in the story of Ibrahim, upon him be peace, when I fall ill, it is He who restores me to health. This action can only be understood by the one who knows the science of medicine completely. This action can only be understood by the one who knows the science of medicine completely. For this science means nothing but the knowledge of all aspects of diseases, their symptoms, and the knowledge of the cure. And among the actions of the Most High, the Exalted, are the determination of the course of the sun and the moon and their stages according to a fixed reckoning. As Allah, the Most High, has said, the sun and the moon move according to a fixed reckoning. And He said, He ordained stages for the moon so that you might count and determine years. And He said, and when the moon will be eclipsed and the sun and the moon will be joined together. And He said, He merges the night into the day and He merges the day into the night. And He said, the sun revolves in its fixed orbit. This is the decree of the Almighty, the All-Knowing. Now, Ghazali says, the real meaning of the eclipse, of the merging of the night into the day and the manner of the wrapping of the one into the other, can only be known to him who has the knowledge of the composition of the heavens and the earth. And this in itself is a science. And then he goes on to give other examples. Now, of course, Al-Suyuti also, he established a type, a law in his Al-Itiqan, about this topic, that the Quran has the knowledge of every single thing. But how did they understood? How did they understand this? They did not understand that the Big Bang and the atoms and the aeroplanes and the trains are in the Quran, but they understood it as the principles. The principles of all knowledge, principles of all sciences are in the Quran, and that is where the breakdown is. The fine point here is that when you superimpose specific theories or specific discoveries, facts or discoveries, it's hard to say facts in science, but let's say, and also technological developments, such as we see in Badiuzzzaman al-Nursi's account of the discovery of electricity, of the aeroplanes, and other such things in the Quran. So, considering all of this, number one, the emergence of this new tafsir tradition, tafsir al-ilmi, is bid'ah in the sense that it does not have a linkage with the 1300 years of scholarship on the Quran. Number two, it does not explain anything new as far as our understanding of the Quran is concerned. Number three, it creates problems in terms of those aspects of the Quran which are supra-scientific, as the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and many other verses. Even the entire order of reality that the Quran has, from the material to the highest order, we cannot even go, as far as the science is concerned, anything beyond the material by the very definition of the natural sciences. So all of that has to be negated before we can address anything in the Quran from the scientific perspective. Now, the objection can be made that, well, why don't we just restrict Why don't we just restrict the scientific tafsir to the so-called scientific verses of the Quran? Now, the answer to that is that, number one, those verses are not in need. Those verses are not in need of explanation on the basis of the Quran, because they have been explained already. Actually, they emerge from a worldview that is ultimately deeply embedded in the whole enterprise of modern science, which, to start with, does not need a creator. We do need, as a scientist, I know this, we do need the initial starting conditions, and that's where most of our problem is right now in terms of science-religion discourse, that we don't have a scientific beginning. Like, once you give me one atom, it's fine. After that, anything can be made out of that atom. But how did this material world, the world of nature, start? That's where all the speculations are, from the Big Bang to the rest of it. But once we have the Big Bang, once we have the initial energy, once we have the content, then we can explain everything without having to invoke the creator, as far as modern science is concerned, because there are theories which can do that. But the interesting fact is that the Quran does not need, the Quran itself does not need that explanatory power of the modern science or any science for its message to be conveyed, because what is being conveyed is at a higher level than the detail that the modern science brings into the picture. The popularity of this new scientific tafsir is also, it has something to do with the political, economic realities of our time. Sometimes I think if we did not have the oil boom of the 70s, when numerous state-sponsored institutions were invented to propagate the scientific tafsir, and huge number of websites and secondary literature has come out of that, would we have the same situation? Very interestingly, after 9/11, the entire group of American and Canadian scientists, so-called people who were in this bandwagon of proving scientific discoveries from the Quran, or vice versa, proving that these discoveries are already in the Quran, all of them came up and said, oh, we have nothing to do with this. Because one of the Wall Street journalists, he wrote an article and he said that Sheikh Zindani, who was the driving force of this whole thing in Saudi Arabia, has ties with Osama bin Laden. So to save their own necks, all of these, and there is a very bad article in Wall Street Journal, he misquotes many people, he misquotes me in that article as well, the writer of that article. But nevertheless, all of them said, well, we went there,